So in this segment we are going to be building a mobile base for our bandsaw. It's just going to be a very common design for mobile bases using lap joints on all four corners. I'm going to inlay these in the middle. It'll get it up to a height where it'll be really close to the level of my table saw, and then I can build something else that will become the outfeed of my table saw. This will just get everything up to that working height. And for rollers, for casters, Rockler sent me these. I bought these when I did my dust collecting system, and I fell in love with them. I didn't know casters could do this one. I always knew you could lock the wheels, but in locking the wheels, you also lock the rotation. So it is extremely stable. I just hadn't seen that. Could be my ignorance. And the tools we're going to be using with this one, because I did bust my bandsaw blade, and I can't get a new one until Monday, where the place that welds them up opens up. We're going old school. All hand tools on this one. So at least I can show you all those techniques. Now, as with everything, our first step is analyzing the grain we want. I milled these up to get pretty rift-sawn and quarter-sawn material, but this was the leftover scraps. I just did the best I could with what I was available because this is just going to be the mobile base. I wasn't too concerned with it. If it warps or something like that, it's not going to be a big deal because the weight of the unit is actually going to kind of keep it flat, and it's just going to take some abuse. But that doesn't mean we can't do the best we can. So this side is kind of wavy. This side I got one kind of weird thing, but that's probably where one of my stretchers could go. I want the long grain to be on the outside, the short grain, because that's what more people will be seeing. There we go. And as usual, I will identify the show corners with blue tape. Now we are going to be using half lap joints. Again, one style of building a frame, and I kind of know a general rule is the long pieces generally go on top. So if I'm doing a half lap, I'm going to be removing that portion there and this portion underneath. So I will go ahead and mark all the parts I'm cutting off just so I don't get confused at a later date. Now, I milled these all up at the same time, so I'm fairly assured that they are all going to be level and they're all going to be the same thickness. But there are instances where you might want to have a thicker end piece and a thinner rail piece. Remember, these are not going to be holding much weight at all. It's just the wheel is going to be underneath the corner, but that's also where the leg's going to be. So this is where all the strength is. So these can be in, you can round these, you can shape these, you could use spindles in between them. They're here just to keep this distance from changing. So you can do whatever you want as far as the design wise, and this might be something you can play around with, but I'm just making a square frame. And to do that one, the first thing I do is set one marking gauge to the width. Now some people will make them a little bit bigger because they feel it's easier to plane off the end grain to level it up. I just go for the right side and plane whatever I need to. Hopefully you don't have to do anything. And from there, it's just a matter of anywhere you have an X, you want to mark a line. Assuming this is square. If it's not, nick it and then use a square to draw your line. And whenever you have a long lever like that, sometimes I find it easier to put a finger right here to press down to get a deep wall, a deeper knife line. Also, you want to mark the sides, but only go about halfway or even a third of the way. Not too far. Next, we've got to find the dead center, and I do this by trial and error. I will kind of pick a spot where you know it's going to be hidden by the joint. Don't do it on the outside because that might show a little bit. So I know this area right here is going to be hidden, so I will kind of just eyeball the center, lock my tool down. And what's cool about these Veritas ones and the type marks is they have a collet on bottom where you can lock it down, and then you can loosen this thing up, and the head actually screws on a threads. So if I twist it, it kind of micro adjusts it. So I've got it locked down with a little bit of movement on the threads. So now if I just come in from both directions and make a small line, well, you see I have my two small lines. So that makes my error quite a bit easier to find. So I can now loosen this up and twist the handle to do a micro adjustment. Kind of eyeball that center again. Find a new space in this area. Mark a line. Flip it around. Mark a second line. And if they're identical, I've now found the dead center. So now, just use that short line you did down the side and mark the center line all the way around the part you're going to be cutting off. This is also the time I will set up my router plane. Now I'm going to darken this in just so the camera can see it. But I've always found that it's much easier to set up your plane when you have that little slot there, so that you can actually bring the blade up to that slot. And you have to remember, you always have to, so we've lowered it down there, you always have to raise the blade of your router plane up in order to get rid of the slop in the mechanism. So right now you can begin raising it up, backing it out until it slightly comes out of that groove. You can kind of see it backing off, and that's when you lock it down. Lock it down good, then make sure you set the little clamp right there so it can't back itself out. And now you have your router plane set up to take exactly half of the board. The next step depends upon how comfortable you are sawing to the line. Because if you aren't, you want to give yourself a little bit of a cheat. So find a single point right there that you could bump your work up against. Then grab yourself a wide chisel. Now the marking that you just did, well, the wheel generally has a flat on here. So this is your show side, so you have a very straight up and down wall right there. Our idea with the chisel is to create a small ramp. Just like that. Going down to the base of that marking gauge line. And that'll give your handsaw a little slot so it will ramp down to that line. So it's a little bit easier to saw on the line if you're not that experienced. Grab your sash saw, carcass saw, crosscut if you've got it, and some way to anchor your work. Now you could just clamp it down with hold fast, or if you wanted to get two anchor points and bump it up to it. I like using bench hooks, and I specifically like using two bench hooks made out of the same board. I basically make these, I cut them in half and spread them out. That way the weight is supported on both sides when I'm sawing. I can press up against the whole board. Grab your wax your blade, and all this is stuff I cover in my sawing techniques videos. I have two videos on that one, part of the classroom series. I will use my finger. I wish I had not cut my fingernails a few days ago, because having a long index finger makes this a lot easier. I'm just going to use a fat. I'm going to drop it on the far side. I'm going to saw across the top, and then I'm going to come down. Now they designed these saws with this little cutout, so eventually you're going to hit this right there, and that'll kind of stop me before I get too far to that halfway line. And then I'll just ride it up and saw down until I get to the line on this side and that side. So it goes pretty quickly. Just find your notch, nibble your way across. Once you're all the way across, start using full strokes. The key is just getting a nice pattern going. Right now, I'm focusing on keeping my sawtooth on that corner right there. It's not progressing down. This side is progressing down, so I can follow that line that I made that's straight up and down. In fact, though, in this kind of lap joint, if this isn't showing, or you're not too concerned with it, if you were to come over a degree or something like that and undercut it a little bit, that'd be perfectly fine. this side. Now I just kind of right my saw up. That baseline there, and something I do is I'll come over and I'll take that initial tooth. See how I picked up the back of it? And I'll saw the middle out a little bit deeper. I find that as you're sawing, a lot of us kind of rock like that, and we get a high spot in the middle. This just kind of clears it out and hopefully gets us a low spot. And that'll make it a lot easier to take the tenon off. Swap it and do the other side. And this should take you about 10 minutes to do all of them. Now a lot of times when I'm cutting the tenon cheeks, I will cheat a little bit. Now remember, this is our waist side, so I want to saw on that side of the line. I did darken it with a little bit of pencil lead so it would show up on the camera. And how do I say I cheat? I actually use two saws. These are both ripped. This is a carcass saw and this is a tenoning saw. Now I actually use the carcass saw because it's a little bit more easier for me to control, to line it up. So I drop my fingernail right there and I'll get the saw kerf going. So I'm sawing down my saw kerf line, not really paying too much attention to the top. So I've got that saw kerf going. I'll then come over and do the same kind of thing to the top, coming across the top. Draw it back and just nibble your way across the top. And once again, all this is in my video on sawing techniques. Now you're actually going against the grain when you saw this way. So you could come over on this side and kind of just focus on coming up the top, which is going with the grain, if you understand the mechanics. But having that little bit started right there gives me something to aim for that's kind of big. There we go. Now once I have those, I have a path of least resistance established for my bigger saw, which is a lot more aggressive. So I can now come over here, get it started, come across the top, along that line. Now all I gotta do is focus on coming down the side, keeping this corner at that point and reading this line. And this saw will move fast. It will move a lot of wood quickly. So once I hit my baseline down here, or pretty close, now I start focusing on riding the saw up. Now once you got there, now it's just a matter of letting the saw do its own work, because it's going to want to follow the path it's created. So I'll come down to my baseline, hit it, and slowly right up. There we go. Now that should pop off once I take it out of my clamp. A little bit more. It might be this side. That's what it was. Before you take it out of the clamp though, you're going to want to clean up this corner with a chisel. I just put a nice little kerf right there. Clean up any schmutz you might have. Now, depending upon how well you did with your sawing, it might be perfectly flat enough to glue up right here. But you can see I was a little bit shy of my line. You can tell the kerf of the marking gauge, there's the indent. So I know I'm not perfect right here. So to make it perfect, what I'm going to do is take another board, which is obviously the same height because that's the way I did it, and that's where when we set up our plane, this is where we're going to use it to level it out. So get it close and you should be able to just kind of take off the high spots. And it's just that one corner that's a bit high. last thing I'm going to do is just put some dividers in here, because to me this center section of a rolling mobile cart is always kind of a waste of space. So maybe if I have a basket of something like that, I can just put the basket in here and it can rest on that one. But you're going to notice I'm just using leftover scraps. And that doesn't really matter, because I'm going to kind of mortise them in, or a half lap wet into this. So all I need to do is set up a consistent depth on all of them. And because they aren't as thick as the board right there, they'll just be sitting flush. It doesn't matter how far down they go here. As long as it's consistent as far as depth, it'll make my machining a lot easier. So I'm just going to come over here, grab my marking gauge, and I do this a lot because I'm a relative measurer. I'm going to say that's good enough right there. Lock it down, and then come down from your show face, so they will all be the same depth. And it's helpful to mark off your waist, because if you went in the center or close to the center, you don't want to cut off the wrong part. Lay some blue tape out so that you can align these the way you want, get them even without marking up your board, because it's hard to get pencil marks off of pine unless you're planing them off, because it kind of seeps into those pores. Now I have found that it's not 100% critical that you get them in the dead center, as long as they are even going across, because if they're slightly cockeyed, people will notice that. But if they're offset one way or the other, you know, 1/8 of an inch, nobody's really going to notice that. So in order to do that one, I pick one side and I measure over it an equal distance both ways. That way, if I am over one way or the other, I'm over the same amount. This is 25 plus a little bit, so I'm just going to go 12.5 right on, simply because I don't think that 1/64 of an inch will make that big a difference. And you're going to notice I'm going to mark right on the wood right now, after just telling you not to, for the simple reason I know that that's part of the board I'm going to be removing. So once you got that there, you can kind of eyeball where you want your sides to be, and then just make them consistent. Now the hardest thing for me to do when I do things like this is getting this distance balanced out, making it look like making them perfectly identical, the overhang in there. And I've kind of come to the point where I get it visually okay, and then I stop trying. If that looks equal to me, I will take my knife, drop it against this side, make a nick, without moving, make another nick right here. Then flip them all over and mark all this side A, and mark all this side B. Because this now is B side, and this is A side. So I will take my marking knife and finding that neck right there, or excuse me, my marking gauge, I would drop it in that neck, lock it down, and then mark all one side. And then just repeat it to the B side. That way it doesn't really matter what the measurements are. They're all consistent, and they're all fitted to this space right here. From here, it's just a matter of clearing off your bench, grabbing a crosscut saw, and having at it. This is one of those times that I kind of think it's much more enjoyable and just as fast to do it by hand as it is to go over, grab the table saw. Because literally by the time I walked over there, pulled out my miter gauge, set it all up, done. Now, if you don't want to saw the ends because it takes time to move it in and out of the vise all the time, there are fast ways you can do that too. Once again, I would just pull up a single point right here, lock it in there, get it close so I can get close to the edge on my workbench, and then grab a chisel. Darken up the line so the camera can pick it out. But basically, I am just going to come halfway up and knock it out. And luckily right now it looks like the grain is running out, so just take advantage of the weakness of the wood. And once you can see how it's splitting, see right now it's splitting a little bit up, you can get closer and closer to that line. And the less wood you're taking off, the more you can get closer, the more control you have. So as I get real close to that line, eventually what I can do is just put my chisel in the little recess and, well, don't do it with your hand, and then just chip it out. And there we go. That way it saves you the time of putting it in and out of the clamp. All we're doing is taking advantage of the weakness of the wood to make our lives a little bit easier. And how accurate can you be this way? Well, if you look right where the tip of my chisel is, you see that little indentation? That's the bottom of my marking gauge knife line. So there's a little bit of a ramp that tool gauge. I mean, this is a very accurate way of doing stuff, and pretty quick. Got them all cut. Now's the time to just kind of line them up. There we go. Make sure they are square. Then use your knife, or if you want to remove the pencil marks, a pencil, and make an outline of what you need to inset. And remember, the base is done with that marking gauge you had in the very beginning. But if you don't remember, if you change the settings, just reset it to what you have right there. Probably a good idea to check it just to be sure too. Now, one cool thing about these flat bottom marking gauges is on things that are this size, you can actually use them as somewhat of a router plane. You know, chisel away the waste and just get this to clean up those last little fibers along the very bottom, because they are a bit of a cutting edge. But because I have it, I'm going to take this time to go ahead and set up my router plane, because that was the task for this job. Though if you are confident in your skills, you can use a power router. Just don't nick your corners. But before you chop out that waste, you're going to have to saw the sides, or at least sever the sides, so just make life easier. So grab your saw, and the idea is to saw the two sides coming down to your baseline here and here. So it's going to be at a diagonal, but the show parts of your joint are going to look incredibly crisp, which is what we want. Now it's okay to go past your line a little bit down here. You just don't want to go past your line up here, because that will show this will be covered up by the wood that's hanging down below. And then just remove a little bit of the material in between, or I should say sever the fibers, just to make it easier to chop out. Now before you go crazy on your chopping, my baseline is right here where my fingernail is. What I would do is I will come in front of my baseline a little bit and chop down just a tad. Basically it's not removing wood, it's actually compressing wood. And then I will come back to my baseline and chop in there. That way I can go a little bit deeper and establish this end point. Same for this side over here. I want to cross cut the fibers a little bit there. But notice I'm not completely straight up and down. I'm ever so slightly to the side a tad bit. Coming back this side, straight up and down, angle it just a tad bit. And then you can begin chopping out a little bit at a time. So I come back inside my middle and I can whack away because I've severed the fibers on this side, so it shouldn't split. Take chunks off at a time. And now you can see we're at where the saw blade was on either side. So now I need to start coming to the side and chopping down before I split it out. And repeat. Slice the sides first, then split out the middle. Now, as you get close to your base line, what I would do is I would come over and I would purposely split the sides out away from that baseline. Not here, because that'll show. Back a little bit. And this is the point you would bring in your router plane to clean up the rest. Leaves you with a nice clean pocket. So real quickly, I made some trim using a router bit to round over an edge, and then I cut that edge off on the table saw and cut some miters on it. I will say, those of y'all that were watching closely, you realize that I cut these mortises on the wrong side, because remember, I wanted the long piece to go all the way through, but if I didn't point it out, nobody would notice that. And as usual, whenever I put these little trim pieces on, for some reason I thought I'd go Norm Abrams, just put a little glue on it and use little pin nails. I never have any luck with pin nails and Southern Yellow Pine. The grain is just way too strong and it just deflects the pins all over the place. I mean, about half of them came off as soon as I lifted this up. So I'm going to give it about 15 minutes to let the glue set a little bit. Then I will take that off and we'll go to the next step, which is installing the casters. And as I said earlier, I did get these from Rockler simply because I had such a good experience with the ones I got for my dust collecting setup, that rolling cart I built. It might just be I've never bought really high quality casters, but man, it's a world of difference from the ones I've been buying from the big box stores, which I end up having to replace every 4 or 5 years. I even had one melt, kind of get soft and come off of the wheel this summer. So these have been working out pretty good. And strangely, there is a specific way you should be installing casters. And this is one of those forehead slapping, yeah, that's common sense, Sean, kind of deals. But there is a greater distance between the edge of this rim and where the casters rotate on the long side. And that's why it's a long side, because you need to have space for your screws. Well, if you think about it, if I were to put this way, that tightens up the short axis. So it becomes fractionally more tippy. If I put it along the long axis, it shortens up the long axis a little bit, but that's a lot less noticeable than on the short axis. I mean, this is pretty much a 2-to-1 box. So you kind of want to have them going along the long axis of your cart. Second is where you drill the hole. Now, common wisdom would tell you to drill it right in the center, right here. But the closer to the edge you get, the more likely woods like this pine right here are going to split. So if we could bring that over just a tad bit, even that much, makes a world of difference. And we're going to use a bit that is actually the size of, the shank is actually the size, the bit is actually the size of the shank. Because we're not really worried about gripping this. We're worried about torque this way and this way, because gravity will keep it on here. So all I'm concerned with is these teeth biting in a little bit. So the ideal place for the screw to go would be as close to your line as possible. And the little flag will knock off the shavings right when you get to the hole. That way you know that you're not just continually pushing the tape up. Now this one right here, yeah, put it in the center. Because whenever you put the caster on, you're going to bump it up against those two holes because they're on the very edge. And these will have some distance to move in case the wood moves, which lengthwise is not going to move that much. So it's not that big a deal. Obviously, you're going to want a flathead screw. I'm using 2 washers for 2 reasons. A, it'll prevent it from busting out through the other side. That gives me about 1/4 inch thickness. And this was the biggest screw I could buy as far as width-wise. I believe it's number 10. The washers will just grip the caster a little bit more. So there we go, a mobile base for our router table. Simple design when you think about it. I mean, it really was just lap joints and a couple inset lap joints. Fairly simple design, but also it is a technique for making those panels in our framing panel design, which gives you options. If you don't like the way I'm about to build the panels for this thing, you can do that way. It's a lot simpler than what I'm about to show you. But once again, this is not only building a piece of equipment for your shop, but it's building a piece of knowledge that you can apply elsewhere. Make your mistakes here. Get your long sides upside down, all that kind of stuff here. Have the gaps here, and not when you're making stuff for a client or stuff to sell, which affects the money coming into your household. So I'll see you in the next segment as we start making the panels for the outside of our case.